Welcome to today's episode of the Cross Labs podcast, On My Mind.
I remember during the hackathon in Weekend, somebody was saying that to simulate a neuron, it's computationally way too expensive to do. I didn't know too much about that problem. With the GPU advances and like really great computational capabilities, I'm sort of like wondering why it's not feasible to simulate neuron activity in a computer.
Basically, it's because they're trying to make biologically plausible neurons. It's not just the way AI does it. They're trying to have spike trains and have potentiation, depression, and so on and so forth. And so the math involved is a bit more complex for each activity. And well, I guess that Nick will tell you more about how parallelizable it is.
If you want to model an actual neuron in the brain, then of course you need a horribly complicated system for that. You can, maybe the Hodgkin-Huxley model, but that's actually just for one point on the membrane of the neuron. So you need to actually integrate over some surface, and everywhere there's this, like it's insane. I mean, you can keep going forever, no? The level of detail. At some point, you're going to have to model the whole inside of the cell.
Basically, that's the idea, is that it's really complex, but it's also that doesn't exist any framework that makes use of GPUs in this kind of fields. So even for all the computation they do that on CPUs most of the time, which depending on how the framework is written might be way slower.
But the question is, what's their purpose,
The purpose is always the same. If they can run 10,000 neurons, they might be able to simulate a brain.
I don't think you should let go of that question so easily, Martin, because there's still the things like when you say, I'm going to go simulate a brain, there's a lot of things about a brain you could be trying to simulate. Even if they get the neurons perfectly, if they don't know how the neurons should be wired up together, you're going to simulate a chunk of neural tissue, which is not the same thing as like simulating a cat.
Yeah, but when you have 10,000 neurons, I don't expect you to have a full brain at that point. And unless you do some very small animals like a fruit fly or something like that, but even then. But those animals, we already have a pretty good mapping of how the neurons are usually wired. So they could achieve that, but I'm not sure how much more interesting the data would be compared to the real things.
And also, I think there have been a lot of projects for the things that have static neural systems to use what would be much more primitive models than what they're proposing, and yet you still actually get a lot of things about the animal. Like Open Worm is Hodgkin-Huxley. That's the project to do a worm body simulator. And I know that they have things like the motion of C. elegans in granular matter, and they replicate like the swimming motions and stuff like that. If you're asking a question about like very, very particular things, like is there aging in seizures or something like that, then yeah, I could definitely see you'd need a much more sophisticated neuron model.
I was wondering, like, what's wrong with the Hodgkin-Huxley model? Because, of course, like, when we have a model, it's a simplification of what's really going on, right? So, clearly, it seems like there's something missing from our simplification.
There's always going to be something missing. I guess the question I'm getting to is, like, which are the things for which that missing stuff matters?
I mean, Hodgkin-Huxley doesn't model the cell. So if the cell ages for some reason, and that's going to, at some point, affect the function of the neuron, then Hodgkin-Huxley is not going to tell you this, for example.
I see. So is like part of the problem, like we don't actually really know like what the connections are about like what's missing from our model of a neuron versus like what is actually important for particular brain functions.
I think the people that model neurons, they probably always know to a certain extent that where they're cutting corners or where they're saying like, yeah, okay, this part, we're just going to ignore it. And then they could always spend more time making a better model.
I think one of the things is that there's a lot of different pressures in just like the academic culture around modeling. And so in general, regardless of whether or not there's a reason for it, you are going to see papers come out that are like, the previous model missed this 1% effect, and we included it, and look, our results are 1% better fit to the data. So there's like this general tendency for models to get more complex because you have to have something to publish. If you can say the other people missed this and I got it, then it's like an automatic, it has to be published. Now we computed the next digit of pi kind of thing.
Yeah, interesting. But yeah, it's probably a bad strategy to go to a conference and say those things.
But it's important too. Like it is actually important to remember that some of these things may not matter. that you should actually have to prove in some sense that it does matter to ask other people to take it seriously in their own modeling, because there's a cost.
That's it for this week's episode of the Cross Labs podcast On My Mind. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you'll be the first to know when the next episode is out. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.